On the 19th of April, 1987, at a remote ranch in California, a team of biologists prepared to do what many people called unforgivable. In the sky, only one California condor remained anywhere on Earth. It was a male that would later be identified as AC9. For 17 years, Amber had tracked this bird. She located it for the final time. Crouching among the low brush, she tightened her grip on the net and waited. AC9 continued circling on the rising warm air before landing 50 meters away. Snap! Within seconds, it was all over. AC9 was placed in a vehicle and taken to the San Diego Zoo, where animal carcasses were waiting for the condors. From that moment on, the species was completely extinct in the wild. The last 27 individuals were all confined behind fences. Scientists called it a rescue. Others called it the final sentence. 40 years later, that decision produced results that even the most experienced experts could not explain. By the 20th century, California condors survived only in the remote mountain regions of California. If you want to know why, some were shot, some died after feeding on poisoned carcasses, and many eggs were taken from their nests. Power lines killed birds with such enormous wingspans, while bottle caps and shards of glass swallowed by chicks caused blockages and death. In fact, there was another, even more important reason, but we will come back to that later. In short, by 1967, the species had been listed as endangered. By the early 1980s, only 22 to 23 individuals remained, and 7 years later, AC9 became the last California condor living in the wild. For decades, however, the official response to the California condor's decline was mainly to observe the birds and protect them through the law. In 1971, California made it illegal to shoot a condor. In 1983, Noel Snyder, a biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, proposed a method that had never been attempted on this scale with a wild bird species in the United States, removing eggs directly from active nests and incubating them artificially. The method relied on a technique known as double clutching. When the first egg disappeared, the female condor would often lay another within a few weeks. This meant that a pair normally capable of raising only about one chick every 2 years could produce more eggs during a single breeding season. As you might expect, the plan immediately divided the conservation community. The National Audubon Society tried to stop it, while activist David Brower warned that birds born in zoos could become welfare condors, existing under the label of wildlife while remaining completely dependent on humans. Opponents argued that capturing the last surviving birds could cause stress, death, and the loss of their natural ability to adapt. Supporters responded that the death rate had already far exceeded the reproductive rate. Without intervention, there would soon be no birds left to protect. Then, in 1985, one condor died during a capture attempt. While the case was being taken to federal court, 4 more birds died in the wild. By the end of 1986, only 27 California condors remained in the entire world. Every one of them had been fitted with a radio transmitter and was being monitored continuously. Population models produced by Snyder's team reached a grim conclusion. If nothing changed, the species could disappear completely by 1990. In the end, the government approved the capture of every remaining bird. During the first months of 1987, radio signals vanished one by one from the mountainsides, as each condor was transported to either San Diego or Los Angeles. By April 19, only AC9 remained. It descended into a dry canyon in Kern County, the net snapped shut, and seconds later, the door of the transport crate was sealed. From that moment on, all 27 surviving California condors were under human care. In the wild, the number remaining was 0. After AC9 was taken to the San Diego Wild Animal Park in 1987, no one knew whether a bird that had spent its entire life in the wild could adapt to captivity. In San Diego, AC9 refused to eat for the first few days. It stood at the back of the enclosure. Staff members wrote in their notes, "The bird is unresponsive. Continue monitoring." Then, little by little, it began to eat. It started interacting with the other birds. Within 2 years, it had been paired with a mate and helped produce its first fertile egg. AC9 later became the father of more condors released into the wild than any other bird in the history of the program. It never knew that. 15 years later, on the 1st of May 2002, AC9 was released alongside 3 younger condors at the Cess Bay Condor Sanctuary. By 2004, AC9 had formed a pair bond, and the pair produced a chick that hatched in the wild. The bird that had once symbolized failure was now helping create a new generation. But breeding a bird does not necessarily mean you have created a wild animal. Young birds can become dependent on the first living creature they recognize as a parent. If they regularly see people feeding them, they may approach campgrounds, beg for food, and lose their natural caution. That is why staff members had to remain out of sight, keep talking to a minimum, and use a puppet shaped like a condor's head to feed, preen, and care for the chicks. This technique helped prevent them from seeing humans as their parents. The goal was clear but difficult to achieve: keep them alive while preserving their wild instincts. The clearest proof came when the first captive-bred condors were released in Southern California in 1992. After more than 4 years with the species completely absent from the skies, scientists believed they had produced birds strong enough to return to nature. But knowing how to fly did not mean they knew how to survive in the wild. Some came too close to people, landing on houses and human-made structures, while others failed to recognize the danger posed by utility poles and power lines. They lacked social experience, were too accustomed to captivity, and had not yet learned how to respond to risks in the natural world. By 1994, the program was forced to recapture every condor living in the wild so the entire method could be reassessed. This was the project's first major failure. Scientists had learned how to produce healthy birds, but they still did not know how to produce truly wild animals. Instead of giving up, they redesigned the entire process. Young condors had less contact with humans, were raised in groups, and lived alongside mature birds that served as mentors. Before release, they had to undergo power pole avoidance training using mock structures installed inside their enclosures. Release sites were also moved farther away from populated areas, and each bird was fitted with a wing tag and a VHF transmitter so field teams could track it after it left captivity. Releases resumed in 1995. Over time, new flocks gradually became established in California, Arizona, and Utah, Big Sur, and Baja California. By mid-1999, the total population had grown to 161 birds, and for the first time since April 1987, some of them were free. In 2021, while examining genetic data from the entire population, scientists made an astonishing discovery. 2 California condors carry genetic material only from their mothers, with no contribution from a male. That is true. They had developed from unfertilized eggs the first 2 confirmed cases of parthenogenesis in this species. What made the discovery even more surprising was that both mothers were living with males capable of reproducing. But do not see this as a way out for the species. Neither bird lived long, they added no new genetic diversity, and they may even have increased the risk of genetic problems. California condors have returned to the skies, but the poison in their food supply is still there. This is the main cause I mentioned at the beginning, the one responsible for the greatest number of condor deaths. From 1,992 through the end of 2025, lead caused 161 confirmed deaths, accounting for half of all wild deaths with a known cause. California began restricting lead ammunition within condor habitat in 2007. A broader law was passed in 2013, and by July 2019, non-lead ammunition became mandatory for hunting wildlife with firearms throughout the state. However, condors range far beyond California's borders. Arizona and Utah rely mainly on voluntary programs, so lead-contaminated carcasses have not been eliminated across the bird's entire range. During hunting season, these states contain millions of gut piles from legally hunted deer, elk, and pronghorn. A condor feeding in Arizona in October can return to California in November with blood lead levels so high that it must be hospitalized. As of 2026, the United States still has no federal regulation restricting the use of lead ammunition. The second problem cannot be solved through legislation. Condor parents feeding near areas used by people sometimes carry bottle caps and shards of glass back to their nests because these objects resemble the small pieces of bone they would normally collect in the wild. Young condors cannot expel these hard materials from their bodies the way adults can. The objects continue to accumulate. Field teams address the problem by locating active nests, waiting for both parents to leave, and then entering the nest cavity to remove the trash by hand. On cliff faces and inside hollow trees, this work is carried out regularly throughout every breeding season, year after year. There is no expected end date. The recovery of the California condor is real, but the conditions that caused its collapse have still not been fully resolved. And even if lead exposure and trash inside nests are brought under better control, each generation of California condors faces a new threat. In 2020, the Dolan fire swept through the Big Sur region, destroying the Ventana Wildlife Society's research facility and release site. Several adult condors disappeared, chicks died in their nests, and all monitoring operations in the area were disrupted. For a slow-breeding species, losing even a few adults does not just reduce the current population, it also removes many future breeding seasons. 3 years later, another threat emerged. In 2023, highly pathogenic H5N1 avian influenza struck the Arizona-Utah population and killed about 21 condors. You can see how serious this was. For a common species, 21 individuals might seem like a small number, but for a population of only a few hundred birds, it represented the loss of years of breeding and reintroduction work. The program was forced to quarantine sick birds, conduct widespread testing, and administer vaccines to hundreds of individuals. These events show that the recovery has never followed a straight line. To prevent a disease outbreak, wildfire, or contaminated food source from wiping out the entire recovery effort, the program does not concentrate California condors in a single location. Instead, separate populations have been reestablished in Southern California, Central California, the Arizona-Utah region, Mexico's Baja California Peninsula, and the Pacific Northwest. This strategy is like placing the species' future in several different safety deposit boxes. By 2024, the California condor population had surpassed 560 birds, the highest level in half a century. About 340 were living in the wild across a range stretching from Big Sur to Baja California and the cliffs of Utah. An official report from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service recorded 607 California condors worldwide, including 392 living in the wild and 215 still within the managed population. Among the wild birds, California had 216, Arizona-Utah had 98, Baja California had 53, and the Pacific Northwest flock had 25. Compare that with 1,987, when only 27 individuals remained in the entire world and not a single one was flying free. In less than 4 decades, the total population increased more than 22-fold. But larger numbers do not mean complete victory. In 2025 alone, breeding facilities still had to release 46 additional birds, while nature produced only 16 chicks that survived long enough to leave the nest. That same year, 22 wild condors died, including 9 confirmed cases of lead poisoning. At conservation centers, 54 breeding pairs produced 67 eggs, showing that population growth still depends heavily on incubators, veterinarians, and the people who manage the birds' bloodlines. But the development that no federal recovery plan had ever predicted came from a different direction. On the 3rd of May 2022, Tiana Williams-Clausen stood at a release site in Humboldt County and watched 2 condors step out of their transport crates before rising above the redwood canopy. Her organization, the Yurok Tribe Wildlife Department, had spent years preparing for this moment. They were not participating merely as partners in a federal program. They were leading it. The Yurok call the bird Pre-Gonish. It is connected to their spiritual life, their prayers, and their responsibility to maintain balance between people and the natural world. When the species disappeared from the region in the late 19th century, the community did not simply lose an animal. It also lost part of its ancient relationship with its ancestral homeland. In 2003, a council of Yurok elders identified Pre-Gonish as the land animal that should receive the highest priority for reintroduction. Tiana Williams-Clausen, a citizen of the Yurok Nation and director of the tribe's wildlife department, became one of the project's leading figures. Her team combined indigenous knowledge with habitat surveys, lead testing, GPS tracking, and modern veterinary procedures. This was not a project created by an outside agency that later invited the Yurok to participate. The tribe itself launched the effort and remained in charge throughout years of preparation. On the 3rd of May 2022, the first 2 birds from a group of 4 left the acclimation facility at Redwood National and State Parks. Imagine that moment. After an absence of about 130 years, wings nearly 10 feet wide, were once again soaring above the redwood forests of the Yurok ancestral homeland. At the time, this was also the northernmost California condor release site. For tribal leaders, the event was a sign that their prayers were being answered and that their responsibility to restore balance was beginning to bear fruit. The most remarkable sign appeared in early 2026. Two condors, A0 and A1, formed a pair on their own, selected a cavity in an ancient redwood tree, and took turns remaining at what was believed to be an active nest containing an egg. It was the first condor nesting attempt in the Pacific Northwest in more than a century. However, no chick had hatched or fledged. By April, the available data suggested that this first breeding attempt might not succeed. In early February 2026, transmitter data from A0 and A1 began showing unusual changes. Instead of leaving together to search for food, they took turns remaining inside a deep cavity in an ancient redwood tree in the Redwood Creek watershed. The timing and pattern of their movements matched the incubation behavior of California condors. The research team could not reach the site directly because the nest was too remote and difficult to access. However, field observations and flight data suggested that A0 may have laid a pale blue egg weighing about 10 ounces, or nearly 280 grams. If confirmed, it would be the first egg produced by the re-established condor population in the Pacific Northwest and the first nest in the region in more than a century. At the time, both A0 and A1 were nearly 7 years old and had only just reached breeding age. They were part of the first group of condors released in Northern California in 2022. Now look at what makes this so remarkable. Both birds hatched in conservation facilities, grew up under human supervision, and were then taken to a forest they had never seen before. Yet after their release, they found each other on their own, established their own territory, spent months searching for a suitable tree cavity, and took turns incubating the egg. Condor parents usually incubate for 55 to 58 days, with both the male and female sharing the responsibility. However, by mid-April, the data showed that both birds had spent an extended period away from the nest at a time when a newly hatched chick could not have survived without care. The research team therefore believed that the pair's first breeding attempt may have failed, although they were still unable to inspect the nest directly. The egg may have been infertile, the incubation period may have been incomplete, or the chick may have been unable to break through the shell. But this was not the end. Young condor pairs often fail during their first nesting attempt. For the first time, these birds were no longer simply surviving because of a conservation program. They were learning how to become a truly wild population. Nearly 40 years after the last individual was removed from the wild, the California condor has returned with a population of more than 600 birds, hundreds of which are now living freely. But this project is still far from over. The species continues to depend on captive breeding, GPS tracking, treatment for lead poisoning, nest protection, and constant human intervention. The future of the program will not be determined only by how much the population continues to grow, but by a more difficult question. Can these birds reproduce on their own, raise their young, and live their entire lives in the wild without needing to be rescued again? This story shows that conservation is not a quick victory. Humans can bring a species back from the brink of extinction, but repairing the environment that caused it to disappear is a task that may take generations. In your opinion, has the California condor truly been saved, or has the rescue only just begun? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to the channel to continue exploring more incredible stories of nature's recovery.